The Nebraska Territory, 1867. A landscape of promises and threats, where the sky was an ocean of blue, and the wind a constant, cutting reminder of nature's indifference. In this place men built with haste, for winter was a predator that stalked the calendar. They built with logs hewn from the sparse river valleys, and they bound them together with the great new invention of the age, cheap, plentiful, factory-made iron nails, all except one man. Elias Thorne was a quiet man, a former shipwright from the coast of Maine, and he was doing something that made no sense. While his neighbors raised cabins in a matter of weeks, their hammers ringing out a sharp, metallic chorus of progress, Elias worked in a strange, deliberate silence. He was not driving nails, he was making pegs. From a small pile of seasoned oak, he would meticulously shape each pin, not perfectly round, but faintly octagonal, tapered just so. His work was slow, methodical, almost ritualistic. He would bore a hole with his auger, the bit slightly smaller than the peg he intended to use, and then drive the wooden pin home with a heavy wooden mallet. The sound was not a sharp ping, but a dense, resonant thud. It was the sound of wood joining wood. To the other settlers, it was the sound of foolishness. They called his slowly rising structure Thorne's Folly. Some, more cruelly, named it the wooden coffin, certain it would never withstand the first great blow of a prairie winter. He was wasting time, they said. He was inviting disaster. What did this man of the sea, this shipbuilder, understand about building a house on the endless wind-swept plains that they, the seasoned frontiersmen and farmers, had all missed? The answer to that question would rewrite the rules of survival in that unforgiving land. So, hit that subscribe button and drop a comment telling us where you are watching from, because the story of Elias Thorne is a powerful lesson in how forgotten wisdom can triumph over modern convenience. To understand the genius of Elias Thorne, you must first understand the enemy. It was not the snow which could bury a man's home, nor the ice which could freeze a river solid for months. The true enemy was the wind. It was a physical presence, a relentless siege engine that never slept. It was born in the Rockies and screamed across 1,000 miles of flatland, gaining speed and fury until it hit the tiny, scattered settlements with the force of a physical blow. This wind was an expert at finding weakness. It exploited every gap, every crack, every seam in a cabin's construction. And the primary weakness, though no one yet realized it, was the very thing they believed was their strength, the iron nail. The conventional wisdom was clear and logical. A log cabin was a fortress. The logs were thick, the chinking was dense, and the nails were strong. Men like Marcus Cole, the region's most respected builder, had perfected the technique. Cole was a man whose word was as solid as the foundations he laid. He had built the trading post, the church, and nearly a dozen homesteads. His structures were known for being tight and sturdy, the best a man could hope for. Yet, even in Cole's best houses, winter was a battle fought indoors. Families would burn through enormous stacks of firewood, and feeding their cast-iron stoves day and night. Still, the cold seeped in. A rime of frost would form on the interior walls, especially the north-facing wall. Ink would freeze in its well. A dipper of water left out overnight would be skimmed with ice by morning. Breath would crystallize in the air, even near the fire. It was a life of constant, draining attrition against the cold. The settlers accepted this as fate. It was the price of living on the prairie. They simply had to cut more wood, wear more wool, and endure. They saw the cold as a monolithic force that pressed in from the outside. Elias Thorne saw it differently. His past had taught him a different way of seeing. In the shipyards of Bath, he had built schooners destined for the North Atlantic. He had learned that a ship was not a rigid box, but a living thing. It had to flex and move with the enormous pressures of the ocean. It had to endure cycles of soaking and drying, of sun and salt, of heat and cold. A ship built too rigidly would tear itself apart. And in those shipyards, the master builders had taught him a fundamental truth. Iron and wood were not friends. Iron was a dead material. It rusted. It conducted heat and cold. When temperatures changed, it expanded and contracted at a different rate than the wood around it. An iron spike in a wooden plank was a point of weakness, a place where the sea would eventually find its way in. The old masters used tree nails, or trunnels as they called them, pegs made of dense, seasoned wood like locust or oak. A trunnel, when driven into a timber, became one with the structure. It swelled and shrank with the wood around it. It held fast, not through brute force, but through a deep, organic harmony. Elias was not building a house. He was building a landlocked ship, designed to sail the brutal sea of a Nebraska winter. As he began his work in the late summer, the spectacle of his strange method drew onlookers. Marcus Cole himself, a man of genuine skill and deep-seated practicality, came by one afternoon. He watched for a long while as Elias carefully shaped a peg with his draw-knife, his movements economical and precise. "Thorne," Marcus began, his voice not unkind, but heavy with authority. "I don't mean to tell you your business, but winter is coming on fast. You're spending a full day on a wall my crew could raise in 2 hours." Elias paused, wiping his brow. He looked at the perfectly fitted logs, and each one joined to the next with a half-dozen unseen wooden pegs. "Time is a tool, Marcus, same as a hammer." Marcus gestured at the neatly stacked trunnels. "Those things have no head. What's to stop a board from pulling right off in a high wind? An iron nail has a head. It bites, and it holds." His argument was sound, based on a lifetime of experience. It was the logic of a carpenter. "The wood holds the wood," Elias said simply, offering no further defense. Marcus shook his head, a look of pity on his face. He pointed to the auger Elias was using. "And you're drilling your holes too tight. When the damp gets in this winter, those pegs of yours will swell. They'll split your logs wide open. You'll have cracks you can put a hand through." It was a specific, technical, and entirely plausible prediction. To anyone listening, Marcus Cole was speaking the undeniable truth of his craft. Elias just nodded. "I'm counting on 'em to swell." That was the final straw for Marcus. The man was not just foolish. He was actively courting disaster. The conversation was retold at the trading post, and the consensus was sealed. Elias Thorne was a stubborn fool. The name Thorne's Folly stuck. Children would sometimes sneak by his homestead and watch him work, whispering and laughing at the slow man with his wooden nails. The mockery did not touch him. His wife, Sarah, would sometimes ask if he was sure. She trusted him, but the certainty of an entire community was a heavy weight. He would simply take her hand and place it on a finished wall. "Feel that," he'd say. "It's solid. It's one piece." As the cabin walls rose, he began another strange process. He laid a floor, but not directly on the ground. He raised it a full 2 feet, creating a substantial crawl space underneath. Then, on the south-facing side of the foundation, he built a low, long box, about 10 feet long and 2 feet high, glazed with the few precious panes of glass he had. It was angled to the low winter sun. At the back of this box, he cut a small opening that led into the crawl space. On the north side of the cabin, he built a tall, slender, chimney-like structure, not for smoke, but made of wood, painted black. It rose from the crawl space up past the roofline. This was too much for the onlookers. It was madness. He was building a glass box to let the winter sun in, they thought, and a wooden chimney to let the heat right back out. The ice box, they started calling it. It was a project so profoundly counterintuitive that it became a form of local entertainment. But Elias was not building a simple box. He was building an engine, a passive, silent engine powered by the sun and the laws of physics. The system was an elegant cycle, a lung for the house. The low winter sun would strike the glass-covered box, the solar collector, and heat the air trapped inside. As this air warmed, it would expand and become lighter, rising. But it had nowhere to go but through the vent into the crawl space under the house. This created a slow, steady flow of pre-warmed air that circulated beneath the floorboards. As this air passed under the floor, it would gradually cool, transferring its modest warmth to the mass of the earth below and the floor above. Now cooler and denser, the air would be drawn naturally toward the north side of the house, where the tall, black wooden chimney stood. This was the solar chimney. Being black, it absorbed any available solar energy, warming the air inside it. This warm air would rise, creating a gentle but persistent upward draft, like a weak flue. This draft pulled the cooled air from the crawl space up and out, completing the circuit. Section. The effect was threefold. First, it kept the ground under the house from freezing, creating a massive thermal battery of stable, above-freezing earth. Second, it gently warmed the floorboards, eliminating the single greatest source of cold in a frontier cabin. Third, and most crucially, it created a slight positive air pressure inside the house. Because the house itself was so tightly sealed by the swollen trunnels, this gentle pressure meant that air was always trying to leak out of any minuscule cracks, not in. It was an invisible shield against the wind's relentless infiltration. He had built a house that breathed, a house that used the sun as a furnace and the cold as part of its engine. It was a system utterly alien to his time and place, born from a shipwright's understanding of airflow and a quiet observer's understanding of nature. But to his neighbors, it was just Thorne's folly, a monument to one man's stubborn refusal to listen to common sense. They finished their own cabins, chinked the logs, stacked their firewood high, and waited for the winter to prove them right. Then November came, and the wind began to bite. December arrived with a fury that stunned even the old-timers. A weather system vast and brutal descended from the Arctic. They called it the Great White Hurricane. The temperature drop was terrifyingly swift. At dawn on the first day, the thermometer at the trading post read 10 degrees Fahrenheit. By noon, it was 0. By sunset, it was 12 below, and the wind was howling at over 40 miles an hour, and it was just getting started. For the settlers in their conventionally built cabins, the siege began immediately. The wind, now armed with fine, stinging particles of ice, found its way in. It came not as a draught, but as a presence. The air grew heavy with a damp, penetrating cold that the stoves could not fight. The first sign of failure was the nails. On the inside of the walls, a perfect grid of frost spots began to appear, each one marking the location of an iron nail. The nails were acting as thermal bridges, on tiny conduits, sucking the precious heat from inside the cabin and conducting it straight to the outside. Each of the thousands of nails in the structure was a pinprick leak, and together they were a gaping wound. Worse, the extreme cold was shrinking the wood of the logs, but the iron nails were contracting even more and differently. The holes they were in became infinitesimally larger. The tight grip of the nailhead loosened. Boards that had been hammered down tight in the mild autumn air began to rattle. The wind, ever the opportunist, forced its way into these new gaps, whistling with a triumphant, menacing sound. Families huddled closer to their stoves, feeding them a constant stream of wood. The roaring fires made the air directly around them scorching, but 6 feet away it was freezing. The heat went straight up the chimney and was lost. Wood piles that were meant to last a month were vanishing in a week. They started burning fence posts, then furniture. It was a desperate, losing battle. Section Marcus Cole was experiencing it firsthand in his own home, a structure he had built with his own hands and considered the pinnacle of his craft. The wind was a physical blow against the north wall, and the entire house groaned under the strain. He could hear the faint, high-pitched shriek of air being forced through 100 tiny imperfections. He had stuffed rags and wool into every crack he could find, but it was like trying to dam a river with a handful of mud. His wife, Mary, kept a nervous watch on the woodbox, which seemed to empty itself as soon as he filled it. Their children were bundled in every blanket they owned, their faces pale. Marcus ran his hand over his north wall. It was colder than a block of ice. He could feel the cold radiating from it, stealing the warmth from his body. He traced the lines of frost that marked the nails, a testament to his own flawed wisdom. He was an expert, the best builder in the territory, and his expertise was failing him. His family was cold, and he was afraid. And in his fear, a new thought began to surface, a nagging, uncomfortable question. What about Thorn? What about the fool in the peg house? He pictured Elias Thorn and his family, isolated in that bizarre structure, a place built in defiance of every known principle of good construction. He imagined the wind tearing it apart, the swollen pegs splitting the logs, the family freezing in the dark. A wave of guilt washed over him. He had mocked the man. He had stood by and let pride build a death trap. The storm raged for 3 days, the temperature plummeting to 30 below zero, with a wind chill that no one could calculate or survive. On the 4th day, the wind slackened slightly, though the cold remained absolute. A kind of grim madness set in. Marcus knew he had to do something. It was partly a sense of duty, a need to render aid if he could, but it was also something else, a desperate need to know. He had to see the failure of Thorn's folly for himself, if only to confirm that his own world, the world he understood, still made sense. He bundled himself in layers of wool and buffalo hide until he could barely move. He told Mary he was going to check on the Thorns. Her eyes were wide with fear. "You can't, Marcus. You'll never make it." "I have to," he said. The journey was only half a mile, but it was a half mile through a landscape transformed into an Arctic hell. The snow was drifted into huge, sculpted waves. The air was so cold it felt sharp in his lungs, a pain with every breath. The wind tore at him, trying to find a way through his layers, and his own breath froze instantly on his beard, encasing it in a cage of ice. He navigated by the faint outlines of fence posts, his world reduced to a swirling vortex of white. After what felt like an hour, he saw it, a low mound in the snow, a single thread of smoke rising from its chimney. Not the billowing, panicked smoke of a fire being desperately fed, but a calm, lazy wisp, almost serene against the gray sky. He stumbled toward it, his body numb, his mind preparing for the grim discovery he was sure awaited him. He reached the door, or half buried in a drift, and pounded on it with a gloved fist. He expected no answer. He was ready to force the door, to find a frozen, silent cabin. The door swung open, and Marcus Cole was hit by a wave of warmth. It was not a blast of dry heat from a roaring stove. It was a gentle, steady, enveloping warmth. It was the air of a different season. For a moment, his mind could not process the sensory shock. The man standing in the doorway was Elias Thorne. He was in his shirt sleeves. Behind him, Marcus saw a scene of impossible domestic tranquility. Elias's wife, Sarah, was at a small table, mending a shirt. The light in the cabin was soft and even, and on the floor, on the smooth wooden planks, their two young children were playing with small carved animals. They were barefoot. Barefoot. The detail broke Marcus's mind. When in his own home, a few hundred yards away, his children were shivering under a mountain of blankets. Here, children were playing barefoot on the floor as if it were a mild spring day. Elias saw the shock on his face and stepped aside. "Marcus, come in out of the cold." Marcus stumbled inside, pulling the door shut against the howling wind. The sudden silence was as startling as the warmth. The cabin was quiet. The wind did not shriek here. The walls did not groan. He looked around, his eyes wide, trying to understand what he was seeing. He saw no frost on the walls. None. The windows were clear, save for a bit of condensation at the very bottom. The air smelled of warm wood and baking bread. He was an expert builder. His mind began to work, to analyze, to investigate. He walked to the north wall, the wall that should have been a sheet of ice. He pressed his bare palm against the wood. It was cool, but it was a neutral coolness. It was not the life-leeching cold of his own walls. It felt inert, solid, deadened. He ran his hand over the seams between the logs. They were perfect. There was no discernible draft. It was as if the wall was carved from a single massive piece of timber. He turned his attention to the fire. The stove was a small one, and the fire within it was banked low, a bed of glowing coals with a single log burning lazily. It was a maintenance fire, not a roaring blaze of desperation. He looked at the wood box next to it. It was 3/4 full. This was the detail that defied all logic. A full wood box. His own was nearly empty. The question came out as a choked whisper. "Elias, how much wood have you burned?" Elias Thorne looked at the fire, then at the wood box, as if making a casual calculation. "Oh, I suppose about half of what we would have in the old place. Maybe a little less." Half. The number was an absurdity. In a storm twice as severe as any they had ever seen, this man was using half the fuel of a normal winter day. Marcus, a man who measured his life in cords of wood and inches of lumber, did the math in his head. The efficiency was not just better. It was an order of magnitude beyond anything he had ever conceived of. He walked over to the small mercury thermometer hanging on a wall away from the stove. The silver line was steady at 68 degrees. 68 degrees. He felt a dizzying sense of vertigo, as if the solid ground of his own knowledge had crumbled away beneath him. Everything he knew was wrong. Everything he had mocked was right. He looked at the solid walls, held together by the stubborn wooden pegs he had derided. He thought of the unseen crawl space, the strange glass box, the black chimney, the silent engine that was warming this home. He finally turned to face the shipwright. He looked at Elias, at his calm and simple competence. He looked at his comfortable, safe family. The words of concession were heavy, but they had to be said. They were the only truth left in his world. "I was wrong, Elias," Marcus said, his voice raw with emotion and the lingering cold. "I was a fool. Everything I said. I was wrong. This is the warmest house in Nebraska. You have to teach me how." That admission, spoken from the heart of the community's most respected expert, was the turning point. The great white hurricane eventually broke, leaving behind a landscape of devastation and a collection of harrowing survival stories. But the most powerful story of all was the one that came out of Thorne's Folly. When the community began to dig itself out, the news spread not as a rumor, but as a revelation. Marcus Cole, a man whose pride was as sturdy as his buildings, became the apostle of the Thorne method. He described the warmth, the quiet, the barefoot children. He confessed his own ignorance with a humility that gave his words immense power. He had been the chief skeptic, and now he was the chief believer. The aftermath of the storm was a harsh audit of their building practices. Many cabins were severely damaged. Loosened boards, split logs from frost heave, and the sheer strain of the wind had taken their toll. The cost in livestock was catastrophic. The cost in human misery was incalculable. But Thorne's cabin stood as if the storm had been nothing more than a spring breeze. That spring, a delegation of settlers, led by Marcus Cole, came to Elias Thorne's homestead. They did not come to mock. They came to learn. Elias, a man who sought no fame, simply showed them. He showed them how to select the oak for the trunnels, how to season it until it was drier than the wood it would join. He showed them how to shape the pegs and how to drive them home. He explained the physics in the simple, practical terms of a craftsman. "The peg is thirsty," he would say. "It's driven into a log that has more moisture. It drinks, and as it drinks, it swells. It grips the hole from the inside. It becomes the tree again." He explained the house's breathing system. He showed them the solar collector, the crawl space, the thermal chimney. He explained how the house made a friend of the sun and an ally of the very laws of thermodynamics that made the wind so punishing. It wasn't magic. It was just a deeper understanding of the materials. Replication began almost immediately. Marcus Cole tore down a wall of his own house and rebuilt it using the Thorne method. The difference was immediate and profound. The next two cabins built in the settlement were constructed entirely with trunnels and raised floors. The derisive nickname Thorne's Folly was never spoken again. Instead, people started talking about building a Thorne house. The transformation of the community was not just architectural, it was psychological. The winter was no longer a terrifying, omnipotent enemy to be endured, but a harsh condition that could be engineered against. The endless, back-breaking labor of cutting and hauling wood was drastically reduced. Homes became healthier, free from the damp chill and constant drafts that bred sickness. The real impact was measured not in degrees on a thermometer, but in the small details of human life. It was a baby surviving its first winter without the constant cough that plagued newborns in cold, damp cabins. It was a family being able to sit down for a meal anywhere in their single room, not just huddled around the stove. It was the quiet, profound security of knowing that when the wind howled, your home was a ship designed to weather the storm, not a crate waiting to be broken. Elias Thorne never sought credit and never asked for payment for his knowledge. He remained the quiet shipwright, a man who had simply applied the hard-won wisdom of one trade to the pressing problems of another. His legacy was written not in books, but in the warm, sturdy homes that rose across the prairie, each one a silent testament to the man who listened to the wood instead of the crowd. The story of Elias Thorne is a powerful reminder that progress does not always move in a straight line. Sometimes the most advanced solution is not the newest or the shiniest, but the one that is in deepest harmony with the world around it. The arrogance of dismissing what we do not understand is a recurring theme in human history, but so is the quiet triumph of empirical evidence over popular opinion. The settlers thought they needed the brute strength of iron, when what they really needed was the living resilience of wood. On this principle of harmonious construction, of using materials that work with each other and their environment, is not some forgotten, antiquated idea. It is the very foundation of modern green architecture and sustainable engineering. The concepts Elias Thorne used intuitively are now studied with complex computer models, passive solar heating, thermal mass storage, and pressure-positive ventilation systems. He was 100 years ahead of his time, simply because he was 1,000 years behind it. If this story gave you a new perspective on how old wisdom can solve modern problems, hit that like button to let us know. And subscribe for more stories of forgotten engineering and frontier ingenuity. We'd love to read your own experiences in the comments. What's the coldest winter you've ever had to face? The account you have just heard is a fictionalized narrative created for educational and entertainment purposes. While the engineering and physics principles discussed, such as thermal bridging, passive solar design, and the use of wooden joinery like tree nails, are based on real historical and scientific concepts. The specific characters, names, locations, and events depicted in this story were invented to illustrate these principles in a compelling way. This content does not constitute professional engineering or construction advice.